about 75 flights up. Below the fire, I saw from the corner, boom, 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 boom.
Started running. All my thoughts started popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Detonated.
Planned to take our building.
It was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before.
It sounded like gunfire. You know, bang, 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 bang.
50 consecutive bangs, and it fell down like a waterfall.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse? To me, it sounded like an explosion. And you heard the boom, 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 boom.
We heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. It looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out. About a second later, the bottom floor caves out. The building followed after that.
Like, it sounded like gunfire. You know, bang, 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 bang. And then all of a sudden, 3 big explosions.
Then somebody said that they saw an airliner going to one of those towers. Then, I don't know, an hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower. I don't know what on earth caused that.
You heard explosions, like boom. There's like a distinct sound. It's not like when the compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom.
We just heard that there was another explosion in the basement or one of the lower levels of the World Trade Center.
Well, that would it would have seemed from that picture that you're right there, Dave, because we
want to go back to Marcia Kramer, who's in the newsroom, for a further update. Marcia?
Well, we have a number of updates. Number one, CNN is now reporting that there was a third explosion at the World Trade Center, probably an explosion from the ground that caused World Trade Center 1 to collapse on top of itself. Again, there was a third explosion. It is unclear what caused it, whether it was a bomb or whether the first plane that crashed into the tower had somehow been booby-trapped with a bomb that was timed to explode later after the crash had occurred. But CNN is reporting that there was a third explosion that caused World Trade Center 1 to collapse within itself and then collapse on other surrounding buildings.
Saw pools of literally molten steel. Molten metal beams had just been totally melted. It was dripping from the molten steel. Steel flowed in molten streams. They're finding molten steel, seeing the molten steel, uncovering red-hot metal beams. Molten metal, red-hot, weeks after the event. Molten steel at the heart of the tower's remains. Molten steel beams, streams of molten metal that leaked from the hot cores and flowed down the broken walls. Molten metal dripping from a beam. The end of the beam would be dripping with molten steel. And this structural engineer, Abu Hassan Astani from Berkeley, cites and documents, I saw melting of girders in the World Trade Center. Still so hot that molten metal dripped down the side of the wall from Building 6. Debris past the columns was red-hot, molten, running. A fire truck 10 feet below the ground that was still burning 2 weeks after the tower collapsed. Its metal so hot that it looked like a vat of molten steel. Pieces of steel, still cherry red.
Structural steel is fireproof to last between 1 and 2 hours, which it did, and then steel melts.
It began to melt the steel. That steel literally melted, and down they came.
Literally melted the steel.
Steel in those buildings is designed to accept 800 degrees temperature, melts at 1,500 degrees, and the jet fuel fire produced 2,000 degrees.
As the steel began to soften and melt, the interior core columns began to give.
So the word melting should not be used for girders because there is no melting of girders. I saw melting of girders in World Trade Center.
But they got soft though, didn't they?
Yes. When the steel gets to 1,000 degrees, it loses its strength.
Astani spent a lot of time attempting to make sure Caltrans didn't recycle the damaged steel, clues to the collapse.
But they've been cut. A lot of them have been cut.
Maybe they're like, I can't imagine, 40 foot.
Yeah, 40 foot. We cut them about half.
What he found out was that it had been taken to a large scrapyard so it could be sold. He called it crime scene evidence and worried it would meet the same fate as the World Trade Center steel.
After 9/11, we realized that Port Authority of New York and New Jersey has sent all the steel that we need to study. That's why I'm here to study steel. Has sent all the steel to recycling plant to go to China for recycling. For what? For 15 cents a pound. Just nothing. And all the evidence of steel went to melting pot.
After 9/11, a law was passed requiring that such materials be saved for study. But in this case, it was Astani's direct dealing with fellow engineers that preserved the evidence.
One of the firefighters said, I think you'd be interested in this, and they pulled off a big block of concrete, and there was like a little river of steel flowing.
See molten steel running down the channel rails, like you're in a foundry. Like lava.
The fires got very intense down there and actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
This fused element of steel, molten steel and concrete and all of these things all fused by the heat into one single element.
And almost like a chunk of lava from Kilauea or Iceland, where they're very sharp but breakable shards on the end here.
You saw steel, some of the thickest steel I've ever seen, bent like a pretzel. And you just couldn't imagine the force that took. The grapplers were pulling stuff out, big sections of iron that were literally on fire on the other end. They would hit the air and burst into flames, which was pretty spooky to see.
There was even a point where you would create an air pocket by moving steel, fueling the fires on the ground, would ignite cars, and cars would just blow up. But, you know, these underground fires were just like the fires of hell.
This is how it's been since day one. Oh, it's unbelievable. And this is 6 weeks later, almost 6 weeks later. And as we get closer to the center of this, it gets hotter and hotter. It's probably 1,500 degrees. We've had some small windows into what we thought was the core at some point, and it looked like an oven. You know, it was just roaring inside. And it was just a bright reddish orange color. See that stuff he's pulling out? What was that, Chief? We're gonna hold off on the water. See the stuff he's pulling out? Yeah. It's red hot. If we hit it too much steam, you won't be able to see what he's doing. Great.
You see how this debris is still smoking? That's from the fires that are still burning. 8 weeks later, we still got fires burning. Every now and then, one of the pieces of equipment will dig in, they'll open up a small area, the oxygen will rush in, and you'll get this plume of brown, black smoke coming up. That's because that fire just got more oxygen. So, I mean, these things are burning. At one point, I think they were about 2,800 degrees.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall from Building 6.
There were fires of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit below the ground.
And all of a sudden, he comes out of this little tunnel screaming, "Wait till you see what I found." And he pulls in ministers and officials, and there, this cross is fully extended, melted together with the intense heat. The two beams were never initially part of the same structure. Heat literally melted them together. And the piece of metal that's draped over was molten metal that had literally fallen over one of the arms.
Steel-toed boots is one of the biggest things.
Steel-toed boots?
Steel-toed boots. Out still on the rubble, it's still, I believe, 1,100 degrees. The guy's boots just melt within a few hours.
It was literally steaming. Your boots would melt in certain areas. That's how hot it was. The steel was coming out red in certain areas from the first couple of weeks at least.